Please come inside. Hey there, let's not meet. It's another sleepless night for me. Browsing Reddit on my tablet because my body hasn't quite realized it requests rest. That tends to happen to me a lot, sadly. Good news for you fine folks though. It means that you get to enjoy a new story. See, one of the pieces on the subreddit reminded me of something that happened outside my own apartment a few years ago. First though, I'll set the stage. Anyways, if memory serves, it was September or thereabouts. The nip of the approaching winter had just started to become evident in the air, and students the world over were all geared up to go back to school. None of this meant a whole lot to me, mind you. I don't have anything resembling a regular schedule. Being a freelancer had up to this point done very little to help deal with my insomnia. It was a pretty regular night for me. I'd finished my allotted work for the day and couldn't sleep, so I was mindlessly browsing the internet, wondering if I should try a few games of League of Legends. I think I might have been snacking on some Nutella as well, because I'm a real adult with real adult responsibilities. Sometime around midnight, my apartment started to feel a little stuffy, so I wandered out onto my balcony for some fresh air. As I glanced over the edge and looked in the parking lot, I noticed something a little odd. There, amongst all the shadowed vehicles, was a car with its lights on and its engines off. I watched it for a good minute or so. I thought perhaps that I saw movement in the back seat, but it was too far to know for sure. I didn't think much of it at the time, and after a few minutes I went back inside. It was probably just a couple getting their jollies off, or a couple stoners deciding to hotbox, right? About 2 hours later, I wandered outside again, perhaps in the hopes that the fresh air would help me relax enough to actually get a bit of sleep. The car was still there, the lights were still on, but there didn't appear to be any movement in the back. Again, didn't really make much of it. Wandered back inside for more internets. I just settled down into bed when I heard her. Though to this day, I have no idea what she said. I still remember the fear in her voice, the broken, quivering timbre of tears and terror. I sat bolt upright, my tired mind trying to process what in the tap-dancing Christ I just heard. All I knew was that it was coming from the parking lot. Then, I heard another voice, male, deep, threatening, aggressive, and clearly very agitated. Again, most of what he said was inaudible. I only caught snippets, but it was enough to piece together some vague narrative. He was yelling at her about something, and she was responding in tears, her voice more and more panicked. He didn't like that. What struck me was how unhinged he sounded, like one of those laughing maniacs in a slasher fiction, like a two-bit sleazy televangelist trying to sell the latest biblical cure-all. The volume of his voice went up and down as he alternated between fevered ranting and infuriated howling. I could only make out 3 words, which he repeated amidst his babbling. Please, come inside. At this point, I love to say that I played the hero. I love to say I went down and confronted the guy, asked him who the fuck he thought he was, but I didn't. I'm the opposite of physically imposing. I'm not a fighter. I've never been. Instead, I picked up the phone and called the police. Ironically, just before they arrived, I heard him snarl that he was going to call the cops. Imagine his surprise when they showed up, a bit more than half an hour after I called them. From my vantage point in my window, I saw someone being placed into the back of the police car. Someone else, a young woman I think, was being escorted into the apartment across the way. I'm not certain, but I think she was still crying. About a half hour to an hour later, the police left. The lights in the car were finally off. I settled into my bed, and finally managed to drift off to sleep. And here's where our story ends. I don't know what happened to the man and woman, nor did I think to ask. I don't think it was any of my business anyways. At any rate, I think I've rambled on enough. Madman in the parking lot. I dearly hope I never meet you. Dan and Puddin'. When I was 13 years old, I lived with my grandparents in a small, relatively rural village in New England. Across the street from our house was a decent-sized wildlife preserve with lots of walking trails and a pond, bordered on its west by a neighborhood of houses with large farmer porches where the families gave out full-size candy bars for Halloween. I was a troubled kid, rebellious, depressed, really struggling with being abandoned by my mom and being bullied pretty badly at school. I would go walk the trails to clear my head or just stew on whatever was bothering me, but also to sneak cigarettes. There was never any problem with me being alone there. It was a safe town, virtually crime-free, and the most trouble we ever had at the pond was kids having bonfires and underage drinking. In fact, I frequently ran into some of my teachers or friends' parents. One particularly rough day, I took a walk down to the pond with a notebook and sat down to write away some frustration. A man came walking in on the paved trail accessible through the adjoining neighborhood. With him was a beautiful huge black dog, who was beyond pleased to see someone new who might want to pet her. She barreled towards me and almost knocked me clean over into the sand. It was the highlight of my week. The man jogged over behind her to reel her in and apologize. "It's okay," I told him. "I love dogs. I'm actually a dog trainer." We got into a casual conversation about dogs and breeds, and he asked me for a couple pointers. "I'm Dan," he finally said, "and her name is Puddin'. What about yours?" For whatever reason, I didn't want to give him my real name. I didn't recognize him from around town, and I'd never seen him here at the pond, and something told me I should give a fake one. "Rachel," I told him. "Nice to meet you, Rachel," he said, nodding his head. "Puddin' seems to like you. I think you're just as sweet as she is." This is when I started to feel very uneasy, and glad I gave him a fake name. He began to ask if I lived nearby. Was I from the neighborhood over here? What street? What school I went to? What bus I was on? It was just beyond a normal casual conversation I expect with an adult, you know? The standard questions about what classes I liked or what I wanted to be when I grew up. This felt intrusive, and I noticed he was kind of eyeing me in a way that made me feel like I was under a microscope. I gave answers that were as vague as possible, but close enough to the truth that he wouldn't catch on to how uncomfortable I was. He asked if I would come to his house to give Puddin' some private training, and he said he would pay me cash, whatever I thought was a fair rate. I told him I'd had to think about it, but it was time for me to go, and took off in the opposite direction. I kind of forgot about it for a few days and life continued as normal, until one day I was leaving school late after band practice. I was waiting for my ride with some friends when I happened to look over at the football field and noticed someone walking around the track with a big black dog. When the person came back around the closer end of the track, I was sure it was Dan, because he was wearing the same jacket as the day I met him. It gave me the willies, but I tried to write it off, because lots of people use our track to power walk or let their dogs go leashless. A week or so later, I saw Dan at the pond again. I immediately thought this was odd, considering I'd never seen him before the first time, and now I'd seen him here twice in a month. He asked me again about private lessons for Puddin', but I told him I just did not have the time right now. Then he asked how band practice was going. I blurted out, "Fine, but it takes up a lot of my time and I have to get going." The whole fast walk home, I am racking my brain trying to remember when I told him I was in band. I'm pretty sure I hadn't. I just had to take a break from the pond so as to avoid more encounters. This is when things got weirder. Over the period of 6 weeks or so, my grandma found a county fair brochure with a part about my dog training club circled, stuffed in our mailbox. We suddenly started seeing dog shit on our lawn and in our driveway. We only had cats. Our neighbors started having problems with a black dog coming into their yard and pissing off their terrier. And the final straw was a photo of the pond, taken from the end of the trail, with a red X drawn on the spot I usually sat, taped to our storm door. I flipped out and told my grandmother about Dan, sobbing and apologizing for not saying anything sooner. She took me straight to the police station to file a report, but I didn't know his last name, or even if his first name was real. I'd never seen him in a vehicle, and had no idea if he actually lived near us or not. I gave them my full story with all the information I had, but nothing ever came of it. The very last occurrence was one night when my grandfather was sitting up late watching TV and heard something rustling in the bushes under the living room window. He peeked out into the yard, and something large was tromping around in there. He went to the front door and saw a dark figure standing in our doorway. My grandfather is career military, extremely protective of me, and takes zero shit. He whipped the door open and started marching down the walkway towards the person, telling them he's calling the police and to get the fuck off his property and never come back without a death wish. The figure took off running, with the animal from the bushes following close behind. I never heard about that last part until years later. My grandfather hadn't wanted to scare me and had the police come with their lights off so as not to wake me. He had many sleepless nights after that, but it was the last event. It's been over 50 years and it still gives me the creeps. I know I'm lucky it didn't escalate beyond that, and I hope he didn't move on to someone else. Don't disregard things or people that go bump in the night. Note to self, don't disregard things or people that go bump in the night. I'm trying to start off with a little bit of background information, because it'll hopefully make it a bit easier to follow along with this whole mess. I'm a 21-year-old female attending a small liberal arts university. My school only has one hall designed as a traditional dorm, and it's reserved for freshmen. The rest of the dorms are designed as suites, most containing 3 double bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a common room, and a kitchen. My particular dorm was one of 2 that offers 4 private rooms, 2 bathrooms, a common room, and a kitchen. I should probably mention that my particular building required your school ID to get into the front building, a key for your suite, and an additional key for your personal room. The suite doors locked automatically, but we were the lucky winners of the room that didn't always lock on its own. Since we live on such a small campus, we never really saw it as a risk. We were familiar with most of the people in our building, and for the rooms we weren't familiar with, our friendly RAs were kind enough to put all of our names and room letters on decorations posted to the front of our suite doors. For future reference, my friends will be known as Lena, Molly, and Sarah. Their boyfriends will be known as Josh, Adam, and Mark. This all started around the beginning of February of my junior year, so about 10 months ago. I lived with 3 of my closest friends. All 3 of them had boyfriends, and at the time I was still single, so I spent a lot of time alone. As I previously mentioned, I had my own bedroom. My friends' rooms were no more than a couple steps away, being that we all still lived in the same suite, but at night, while they were all tucked in tight, and their men and I were alone in my bedroom, it wasn't uncommon for me to freak myself out. The first night he came, I had been up late studying for a Spanish test. Around 2:35, I unplugged the light that hung from my ceiling, got undressed, took off my glasses, and laid down. It wasn't uncommon for me to be up at this hour because I had been suffering from severe insomnia, brought on by chronic nightmares, so it is likely I would have been awake even if I hadn't been studying. What is uncommon is that this night, of all nights, I decided to sleep naked. I never did this because I was always freezing, but for some reason, I guess I was hot. At exactly 2:44 a.m., I heard the door in our common room open. Our door made a decently loud squeaking sound every time someone opened it, so it was easily distinguishable. I thought this was odd, because none of my suite mates were ever up that late. Lena and Josh were asleep in the room directly next to mine. Molly and Adam were asleep in her bedroom at the opposite side of the suite. I knew for a fact that Sarah and Mark went to sleep in his room in another building for the night. As I was laying in my bed facing the wall, I told myself not to freak out. It was probably just one of my friends either leaving or going after arguing with their boyfriend. As much as I wanted to believe this, I could feel that something was off. About 2 minutes passed, and that's when I saw the reflection of a flashlight on my ceiling. It was coming from underneath my door. A little more anxious at this point, I again convinced myself that it was one of my friends. Someone began to slowly turn the handle of my door. Whoever was at my door was obviously unaware that my door was uneven, so every time it was opened, it would swing completely open. At this point, my heart felt like it was going to beat completely out of my chest. I did not want to leave my position of staring at the wall to see who it was, but I knew I had to. I propped myself up, careful to make sure my blanket stayed covering my naked body, and saw a man standing in my doorway. He was shining a flashlight directly onto me. I'm nearly blind without my glasses anyways, so I could not make any specific features in the dark. All I could tell was that this guy was decently tall and was wearing sweatpants, a hat covered by his hoodie, and a backpack. We stared at each other for about 30 seconds, until he literally turned around and started sprinting away. As soon as he was gone, I darted out of bed, put on clothes and my glasses, and ran into the hallway. He was definitely nowhere in sight, but I went back into the suite and locked the door. I attempted to wake up Molly and Adam, but she was a bit of an ass when someone wakes her up, so she shooed me out of the room. I obviously didn't sleep the rest of the night, and reported the incident to campus safety in the morning. The main security officer asked me to recall the details of the night, and told me he would file a report. He said that it was most likely someone who entered the wrong room, and that the guy was just as freaked out as I was. I wanted to believe that, because it was a lot less creepy, but I knew that I couldn't, because all of our names are on the suite door. He knew exactly where he was going, and who he was looking for. Nothing happened for about a month. The next occurrence came around the same time of the morning, but this time, it was a flashlight outside of my window. I tried to stay out of view, and the light went away fairly quickly. I tried to let this one go because I didn't want to think about what might have really been happening. I told a friend of mine about the flashlight the next morning. She lives on the same floor as I do, but in the building next to me. She freaked out when I told her about what happened. In the moments before the flashlight appeared in my window, she happened to look out her window. She made eye contact with a man, holding out the flashlight on his phone. As he was walking towards my window, he darted away when they made eye contact, and it was too dark for her to see where he ended up. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday, my dad called and asked me to go to dinner. I go to school out of state, but my dad does a good portion of his business in my school state. When I got back to the room that night, my friends had already left and gone across campus to a party. The plan had been for me to meet them there once I was back from dinner and done getting ready. They were at the party of a guy I was talking to at the time, who later became my boyfriend, which comes into play later. As I'm getting ready alone in my room, someone begins violently pulling on our suite door. Still creeped out by the previous occurrence, I cautiously walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Surprise, surprise, it was covered. The guy across the hall heard the commotion and chased whoever it was out of the building. Behind our dorm is a wooded area, and the guy lost him at the entrance. By now, I'm already on the phone with my friends, and we're all in a panic. One of the guys across the hall drove me to the other side of the campus to be with my friends, so that I didn't have to walk alone. We were all freaked out, but let it go for the time being. Nothing happened for a couple weeks after that. Fast forward to spring break. The week everyone arrived back was pretty normal. The guy I had been talking to, Jared, became my boyfriend, and I started to feel much safer as he slept over. About another week went by before anything happened again. It was the beginning of April, when what I had concluded to be my stalker showed up again. He seemed to have a thing for showing up between 2:30 and 3:30, possibly because he knew I was typically the only person awake during those hours. I apologize for this next part, because it's probably too much information, but it was 3 a.m., and Jared and I were fooling around. As I'm half naked and going down on him, I see a bright light shine through my window. This time it was different than the last. It was as if the person had the flashlight and their body pressed up against my window. By the way, my window never actually stayed locked. Most of the windows on campus were that way, so I guess my school is cheap. I freaked out and jumped up, pressing my body against the wall to try and get as far out of view as possible. I felt violated and exposed. I didn't want anyone to witness what was going on, especially not a complete stranger. I'd had enough of all of this. As if I didn't have enough difficulty sleeping already, now I had to add watching out for creepy guys who go bump in the night to my list of reasons as to why I couldn't sleep. I reported the incident to campus safety yet again, and again they promised to look into it. They had already told me they were planning to put video cameras on the back of my building to try and catch whoever this was. Clearly that never happened. Another couple weeks go by, and we're about a week and a half away from finals. By now, I look like complete shit. Professors start asking questions, friends unaware of the situation express their concerns. All I could think about was finishing finals and praying that this would all be over. I wasn't lucky enough to escape without a final goodbye from my late night visitor though. My boyfriend and I were asleep in bed. Yes, I was actually asleep for once. There was a point in time when I was a heavy sleeper, but that time had long since passed. It was as if my brain was subconsciously on high alert at all times. I awoke to a strange sound. It wasn't very loud or threatening, but I still waited for a few seconds before opening my eyes. As soon as I opened my eyes, I instantly knew that my bedroom door was open, and throughout the entirety of my life, I've always slept with my door closed. My room is pitch black, and as I said before, I am as good as blind without my glasses, but this did not stop me from spotting the shadowy figure moving away from my bedroom door and into our common room. Terrified, and praying that I was about to wake up from one of my nightmares, I didn't move. I wanted to keep calm and pretend it wasn't real. This lasted all of about 30 seconds before I shook Jared awake. I told him about what I thought happened. He was tired and definitely annoyed, but still agreed to go check the common room. Jared was in the common room for a couple minutes. I started to get nervous because he hadn't come back yet, so I went to check things out for myself. I found him in the common room just looking around. He hadn't even bothered to turn on the lights. Maybe he was still half asleep. Maybe he was scared what he would find. Who the hell knows? He saw me come in and tried to reassure me that he looked around and found no one. This is when we turned on the lights. One of the common room windows was completely open, and the blinds were half destroyed. I looked at Jared with tears in my eyes, and my whole body began to shake. He said he hadn't even noticed the window, because the chair was in front of it, and the blinds were technically still down. He closed the window and tried his best to lock it. Somehow he calmed me down and convinced me to go back to bed. He was able to eventually fall back asleep, but I laid in bed the rest of the night, fearing that this guy was going to come back. Finals concluded, and I returned to my home state for the summer. I never learned this guy's identity, and still can't decide if this was a blessing or not. There were no signs of anything like this happening at school while I was home, although I did receive an abnormal amount of phone calls from blocked numbers. I've since returned to school, and am halfway through my senior year. My friends and I relocated to a building on campus that requires each person to have a roommate, so I feel safer than I did before, but I still have trouble sleeping. Nothing super weird has happened yet to this day, so I'm hoping it stays that way. For those of you as naive as I was, please understand that even the smallest, safest places are not as safe as you think. Lock your doors, lock your windows, don't go anywhere alone late at night. Pay attention to your surroundings and be aware. As for Mr. Creepy Stalker, who had an odd fascination with windows, please, for the love of God, let's never meet again.